Well, good afternoon, colleagues, and a special warm welcome to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat McFadden. Pat, it's great to see you. And the Permanent Secretary, Catherine Little. This is 2 weeks, 2 shows, so we are forging that good relationship with the Cabinet Office, which we were determined as a committee to have. And again, thank you so much for coming to join us this afternoon, forgive me. I think the two main topics, Chancellor, that we want to go over with you today is missions, the whats, the whys and the wherefores, and civil service issues. And if we've time, we will wish to touch on intergovernmental relations as well. But I'm going to sort of kick off, if I may, on the missions. Every government coming in will use some sort of language which says this is how we're going to deliver things, it's a mission, it's a whatever it may happen to be. Could you just give us a feeling, as it were, as to whether you think a machinery of government reshuffle is required to help deliver the missions, given how very siloed Westminster and Whitehall is? So that's your sort of starter for 10.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I'll do my best to answer the committee's questions over the period of time that we have. To begin with missions, the idea was to have some big long-term aims, as well as managing the day-to-day stuff that any government has to manage. A government has to operate, if you like, at more than one speed. There's always events, as was famously said. There is the famous government grid. There will be international engagements that a Prime Minister has to do. There's weekly Prime Minister's questions and so on. And it's very easy to feel incredibly busy all the time and to deal with all the urgent things, but there's a difference between the urgent and the important. I'm not saying those short-term things aren't important, but we felt before the election it was good to have a number of big long-term aims, and that's why we had these missions around the economy, the health service, opportunity, crime and clean power. And in terms of machinery of government, you're right that there's a lot of Whitehall DNA around departments. That's traditionally the way spending's worked, and these departments have a very enduring identity. It's remarkably enduring, actually, despite changes of political colour of the party in power and obviously changes of Secretary of State. So we are trying to do something that's quite ambitious here, which is to get them to work across those departmental lines to deliver these long-term missions, and to make sure that in between the urgent there is a drumbeat of work that's aimed towards the long term. And the architecture that we set up at the beginning of this Parliament was to have a number of mission boards, each of which is chaired by the relevant Secretary of State, who's the mission lead and is in charge of delivering their mission. I serve on them all, alongside the chairs. We established a mission delivery unit inside the Cabinet Office, which works with the different mission leads in each of the departments. And then the Prime Minister chairs stocktakes with each of the mission leads to drive progress as well. And in between that, there's a lot of informal contact. There's my own bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister. And that is essentially the architecture that we've set up to drive it.
The mission boards, how is the government intending to have sort of transparency and accountability on those? Will memberships of them be in the public domain and revised as and when they change? Will we know what the agendas are? Will we know what matrix they're using to measure success, progress and failure?
Oh, you'll know the metrics of a lot of the metrics were set out in the plan for change that we published last week.
I have a copy here,
which we may come to. So the metrics certainly, in terms of attendance, that might vary depending on the subject under discussion. Location might also vary, because one of my messages to all the mission leads is this isn't just a Whitehall exercise. Let's get out of Whitehall. Let's speak to all the expertise there is around the country. So we won't always say the mission board is meeting today and here's who's coming, but the goals are public. The goals for this Parliament were published last Thursday, so it's clear what they're trying to do.
And are the boards a replacement of or ancillary to the traditional cabinet committees?
They're not a replacement for the traditional cabinet committees. We have cabinet committees, a Home and Economic Affairs cabinet committee and so on, that deals with the day-to-day business of government. Their work carries on as normal.
Who's the ringmaster? Is it you? Do you hold both the carrot and the stick in this increasingly siloed Whitehall that we all know about?
The Prime Minister is ultimately the ringmaster always, but Prime Ministers are
busy people.
Very busy people.
He's delegated to you, effectively,
and
hasn't
so
he?
On a day-to-day basis, he has asked me to coordinate and drive this work. But I do stress there was a decision taken to have these boards chaired by the mission leads to make sure they were accountable for delivering their mission. It wouldn't be the right thing to do to just relieve the departments of their responsibilities and locate it all in the Cabinet Office. We have an important coordinating role. We can chase, we can ask questions, we can challenge, but the actual delivery and the bulk of staff and so on are in the departments themselves. Sorry.
You can't tell. You can't instruct.
Well, ultimately, the Prime Minister can. Yeah.
And so is that power of instruction also delegated to you?
Look, if there was a dispute, it would be elevated to the biggest authority in government, which is the Prime Minister. We prefer to work in a collaborative way, but ultimately the reason we have stock takes is with the Prime Minister is precisely so that he can press, are we going far enough, fast enough here? I want more information there. What is your plan to get to this? That is what the function of those meetings is.
The Prime Minister said recently that mission government will, and I quote, change the accountability incentives in government. What did he mean by that?
He meant that when you set out big long-term goals like we did last Thursday, it's clear what the direction of travel should be. And so people really now know what their aim is over the next 5 years.
Yes, but how does that incentivise accountability?
Well, if you're the Secretary of State for X and you've got an aim in this document, you know the Prime Minister is instructing you to do everything you can to deliver it.
And do you see any merit in a... And I appreciate for some machinery of government reshuffles are just, changing the brass plate on a door. But do you see any merit, you're a few months into government, any merit at all in a fundamental review of how the machinery of Whitehall looks? Because I think there's an anxiety, if I can put it this way, of trying to retrofit a new way of delivering government and policy from an old machine.
Yeah, well, look, I can't say never to that because you never know what, a Prime Minister might decide to do on machinery of government, but we came into office without the intention of tearing up the departmental structures. I'm one of the few people in this government that served in the last one.
Indeed, with distinction, I think.
There's not very many of us because we were out of power so long. So most ministers are new, we've got some collective experience, but not a huge amount of the past. And machinery of government changes. They might have their fans, they might have their sceptics. On the sceptical side, you could argue that they can take up a lot of energy, they can take up a lot of heat, they cause a lot of friction, people get very preoccupied about the new name, the new identity, the new this or that. Do you really want to do that, or do you want to focus the energy of the system on the outcomes? And we took the latter view, that we should focus on the outcomes. Does that mean the departmental structure will always stay forever exactly as it is? Of course I can't say that, but we didn't come into government intending to do a lot of machinery of government changes. There was a bits and pieces. For example, you said we were maybe going to touch on intergovernmental relations later in the session. That was a function that was in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government.
Yes, indeed.
And it was one of those situations where I think I'm right in saying it was under the previous administration, but the reason it was there was it was a personnel decision. It was because Michael Gove was the Secretary of State, and he was judged, for totally understandable reasons in my view, to be a Secretary of State with experience and standing in that field of intergovernmental relations. This Prime Minister took the view that the natural home for that function probably wasn't that ministry, but was back in the centre of government at the Cabinet Office. So there's been some movement of functions, but not a wholesale redrawing of departments.
You talked there about sort of energy to deliver. How much delivery energy can one find in a tepid bath?
Well, I think the systems don't always focus on delivery as much as they should. There's a lot of process, and there's processes there for a reason. People like to do things properly. What I think the Prime Minister was saying in using that phrase was, let's focus on delivery and focus on outcomes. And that's very much the spirit of the document that he published last week.
Thank you. Two more quick questions from me. Just one back on the missions board. Is it just ministers who sit on the board, or is it populated with officials and or external
officials too, and people can be invited in? I'm keen to have these things open to outside expertise. So it's not just ministers. Ministers are there, but there are others too.
Okay. And let me ask you this almost philosophical question. You referenced you were a minister under Gordon Brown, actually quite a long time ago when you think of it.
No.
What has it been a shock as to how Whitehall now works, how the world of work and policy delivery has changed these last 14 years? And is there anything that you found where you thought, dear God, I thought they would have finished doing that by now, and it's still on the agenda?
It hasn't really been a shock. There we are.
Well, you're a very sanguine man, aren't you? You don't get shocked easily.
There we are. Look, a lot has changed. I mean, my goodness, since 2010, when the last Labour government left office, most obviously the two biggest things have been Brexit and then the experience of the pandemic. I think they both had obviously big influence on government and what it did. When we left office in 2010, we were just coming out of the great financial crisis. An awful lot's changed, and the country's a very different place. Technology has changed massively, and I think that I made a speech yesterday about how that should change the functions of government. But a lot of the Whitehall processes are still quite familiar.
I'm going to turn to Lauren now, I think.
I've got one more question before I get to that one. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about...
Just a little bit. I'm going to go to Lauren, then I'm going to go to Luke, and then I'm going to Charlotte.
Just a quick question on, I guess, achieving the outcomes of those missions. Obviously, as a government, you can set the missions and you obviously have a huge role in implementing them. But I'm quite conscious, I come from a local government background. They are on the pointy end of actually making a lot of this stuff happen, particularly when you're talking about growing the economy and having that across the regions. How are you planning to work with local government in particular, as well as the private sector, as well as the devolved authorities, to really make sure that you're achieving everything that you want throughout the UK?
Well, they're challenging to achieve. It's the first thing to say. They're not easy. This isn't like me running my Saturday morning park run and saying, won't I be doing great if I can do it in less than 30 minutes? These are challenging things to do. I would like to think they are the country's missions, not just the government's. You know, we have a national challenge on waiting lists. We have a national challenge on not having built enough homes for many, many years, and so on. So we definitely need the buy-in, the support, the partnership, the expertise of others to do that. Local government and mayors are very important. I think the great advantage, I know local government's under a lot of financial pressure, and that narrows the options. But at its best, local government, the great advantage of it is it can be innovative and creative and show you ways to do things that maybe haven't been done elsewhere. And one of the things I was saying in the speech I made yesterday about reform of the state was this idea of test and learn, of not always doing policy the traditional Whitehall way of the white paper, national implementation, all at once, but actually taking an idea, developing it, testing it, possibly with some failure at first. And people are scared of failure, partly because they'll be come in front of a committee like this and you know, people will say, why did you let that fail? Why didn't that project work? But we have to have a bit more tolerance of that if we're going to develop things in the right way, because human life is complex, and getting very clever people at the centre to always design it perfectly doesn't always work. And if you look at the way that products and services have developed in the private sphere, particularly with services and technological companies, this idea of test, learn, fail, develop, make it better in real time is embedded, and it's very innovative and creative. So that's what we want to do, and that's why yesterday I announced a few of these projects which are in partnership with local authorities.
Charlotte.
Yes. Let's go to Luke now, and then I'll come to Charlotte. Luke Taylor.
So we've spoken a little bit about the machinery of government. We've talked about, you've outlined the mission boards, the delivery units, and how the mission leads and the boards fit together. The Prime Minister's talked about rewiring the British state. So we've got lots of mechanical descriptions of things there. What other changes do you anticipate to have to make, or is that going to be as a result of seeing whether anything continues to work or not?
Well, I think the test and learn idea is an interesting one that I was just speaking to Ms. Edwards about. And some of this has been done. One of the examples I spoke about yesterday was the universal credit system. This was a story of two halves. When the idea was first mooted in government, it was very difficult to get off the ground, and they burned through a lot of money without making much progress, and they had to stop and, to use another term of the moment, reset, and they took it away from its usual circumstances. They set up a small team of about 30 people, which included policymakers, IT people, frontline workers, and they started really, really small instead of trying to do it all at once. And they took it very step by step, learning as they went. and so you had a very gradual rollout. And then in the pandemic, when the system was under a lot of pressure instantly, it performed very well. Now, you can always have a debate, and maybe a political debate in this House, about how much the benefit should be. That's fine, but as a mechanical system of getting money to people, they developed a system that worked well under great pressure during the pandemic. So I just use that as an example of something. Another one is the passport service, which works extremely well. But again, a few years ago, some of you are new MPs.
We had urgent question after urgent question
those
after
of
urgent
us
question.
who were in the House
Yeah.
some years ago, it was very creaky, and our constituency offices were under siege from people who couldn't get a passport in time to go on holiday, and they rebooted and reorganised the service. And actually, sometimes now you hear people use it, and it's a sort of backhanded compliment, because people will have a certain perception of what using a public service will be, and they'll use the passport service and they'll say, do you know what? It was really good. And there's a slight tone of surprise, which is a shame. And I would like that tone to be seen in more public service. And the truth is, there's too many things in the country that aren't working properly at the moment. So I'm keen, you asked me what other changes. What I'm keen to foster is a culture of curiosity about why some things work well and why others don't, and to learn from the ones that work well. I think curiosity is a real duty of those involved in public life, to learn in that way.
Does that curiosity then extend to trying things and allowing them to fail, and then learning from them and improving?
I believe it should. I think we need a greater risk appetite. There's a lot of things that militate against a greater risk appetite. One could argue the structure of being hauled before select committees sometimes does, because people will say, why did that project fail? But that's part of our democratic accountability. Another example on risk appetite is the previous government set up ARIA, and that channels funds for research, and it was deliberately designed to have a greater risk appetite and probably a greater risk of failure. And the reason it was done like that was because when you're engaged in cutting edge research, if you only bet on the absolute safe bets, you will never find the new discovery. So it's absolutely sensible in circumstances like that to build a risk appetite into it.
And just on that, is your assessment that you're able to foster a risk appetite and that inquisitiveness that you spoke of a moment or so ago, with very, very detailed, experienced people, or from what has been a general trend of moving away from expertise in the civil service and buying that in on an ad hoc basis and relying upon the enthusiastic generalist?
That's an old debate, this, isn't it? The enthusiastic generalist. Look, I don't want to... How can I put it?
I mean, I'm never entirely convinced it's one or the other. I think you should have both.
Yeah, it's a very old debate. That one of the other things, sorry to keep referring to this speech I made yesterday, but...
We will all go out to Chancellor and buy a copy of this speech.
You can get one for free, actually. I talked about this notion of a tour of duty. And it's not, again, there has been a programme already, but in a very small scale about this, about innovation fellows. And the idea is to ask people to come in for a 6 to 12 month period and perhaps help us crack a problem. They don't have to have a whole career in the civil service. It doesn't have to be that life-changing, right, that's what I'm going to do for the next 10, 20 years. But to come in for a short period. And one of the challenges we have is, particularly in the tech world, is salaries and what people can earn outside compared to what they can earn inside. But I would like to appeal to the public-spirited nature of people who could help us solve some projects that deliver for the public. And I think there are people out there who do want to do good for the country. I'm not saying they're going to work for free, but they don't have to make a whole career of it. So I think this idea of a tour of duty is one that we should use.
I agree with you. Can I just ask you one thing that flows from that, which is the ACOBA rules often mean that those public service motivated people who say, fine, there's a nut that needs cracking. A cabinet officer or a secretary of state reaches out, can you come and help us? We understand you've got expertise, commercial expertise or whatever. Yes, of course, I'd love to. And of course they've got inside knowledge because they've been working within a department. And ACOBA says, of course, you can't go back to the day job once you've finished because you have specialised knowledge and you have to have everything cleared and there has to be breathing space and all the rest of it. In order to get that tour of duty, there needs to be some changes to ACOBA, surely.
Well, let me bring Kat Little, the Permanent Secretary, on this because, as I say, this has been tried in a small way, these Innovation Fellows, before.
Yeah. So I think there is a general point about ACOBA can be a massive deterrent to people coming in, and that's on the assumption that people understand exactly how the rules impact on them. I think there's a lot more that we need to do to explain it, but I think we need to make sure that there are exit strategies and that the terms and the conditions are clear up front, and that is what we do with the innovation fellowships. Is, they're not coming in on full civil service terms and conditions. We're creating secondments, we're creating bespoke arrangements so that there's a clear exit path and a clear understanding of the difference of the role. So expanding it, yes. Looking again at how we define the rules, yes.
We have a note on that in due course. That would be very helpful. Charlotte Kane.
Yes, so I wanted to go back to the test and learn idea, which I think is an interesting idea. How are the teams going to be made up? Are they going to have junior and senior staff and external people?
That's the idea. So the Chancellor announced a budget of £100 million, so an innovation fund to fund these projects. I announced a few yesterday based around the twin problems or twin challenges of temporary accommodation and family hubs. And the idea is you do have policy people and practitioners and technology and also the users of the service as well, because that's who it's all for, to help design, help crack these problems, see if we can do this better, and you use the experience, as Miss Edwards said, of local government, some of our mayors and some local leaders as well, because they know their area better than anyone. Those are just the first couple, but there'll be more of these going forward. And my colleague, Minister Georgia Gould, works a lot on this idea, and this is just the early stages of it.
And will they have different rules to the standard civil service rules, financial regulations, governance? Will they be able to move
They'll
quickly?
still have to obviously account for public money and so on, but I think when you start this, you will realise that it won't always work at once. They may get something wrong, but if something's going to go wrong, I'd rather it went wrong in a small way than a huge way. And also, the cost of the status quo is often very high. There's a huge amount of money spent collectively around the country on temporary accommodation. Now, are we getting the system right? Can we improve that system? Let's try this project and find out.
So you touched on the fact that some of these will fail. How are you going to bed in the acceptance of that from the minister all the way through, that the project failing is about learning the lessons from it rather than a failure and it shouldn't have therefore been done?
Well, that is the basic concept from the get-go. There's been a lot of talk of, Elon Musk in recent months. And he says that every time one of the rockets blows up in space, they learn a huge amount. They learn, exactly what went wrong, how to fix it for next time. Not everything works first time.
But how are you going to embed that? How are you going to convince the staff, in particular, that they are going to be assessed on how they went about it, the lessons learned, what it can lead to in future, rather than assessed on the fact it didn't succeed?
They know from the beginning that that's the idea behind it. You're testing and learning. And failure isn't a final thing. It's just the way you did it that time didn't work. And so you can improve the way you did it for next time, hopefully.
I hear that, but how are you making sure that the more junior staff are convinced by that?
Well, it should be the spirit of the team that they're working in.
Could I perhaps just add to that? So I think it's my responsibility to make sure that that is the case across the whole of the civil service. And it's a combination of culture, tone set at the top by our political leaders, and the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster is entirely right. We set that clarity out front, but it's got to be backed up by performance management, really great line management training. So we set standards for line managers across government. We need to build it into the way in which they coach, mentor and support staff. Now that takes a bit longer in a kind of an organisation with the complexity and size that we are. So for the Cabinet Office, we've got to make sure that there's process through performance management, the incentives, and that people understand the training and the line management expectations for this.
And then when you've got these various projects that have happened, and you've learnt lessons, good and bad, how are those lessons going to be shared more widely around the civil service?
Well, if they manage to deal with the two challenges they've been set in different places, these are not in the same place, then obviously you try and replicate that elsewhere. But again, one of the things to remember here is not every area of the country is the same either. They have their own characteristics and so on. So, it's not always a case of taking it like a cookie cutter and just putting it elsewhere. But if we get success and we think we can save money or get a better outcome, or hopefully a combination of the two, then we'll try and replicate it elsewhere.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, where you don't get success, but there are still lessons to learn. But there are still lessons to learn.
Of course.
How are those going to be shared around?
Well, people will know what went wrong and why it didn't work. They say failure is a good teacher, so we should learn from failure as well as success.
Just two things I'd add. We have an evaluation community across government, so every department has expert evaluators, and one of the things that we're very keen to promote is active live evaluation of every policy and programme that we do in government. So that's important, and it's a real skill. It's a very professional skill set. And the second thing is we've got these amazing communities of best practice and professional networks in government who get together to share learning all of the time. And of course, we've got to celebrate and talk about it. The civil service isn't very good at talking about when we've got things wrong and what we've learned. We're not very good at celebrating when we get things right. So, we've got the Civil Service Awards, which is our annual event this evening, and I'm looking forward to celebrating a lot of our winners and some of the great things that they've done.
I mean, we've heard elsewhere that even within departments, there's a belief, well, we can't share this data between one directorate and another within the same department because of GDPR and all the rest of it. I mean, this is, what both of you were saying is compelling and common sense. But you've got the accountability frameworks, which organisations like the PAC take very seriously, which do not in any way, Chancellor, encourage or would countenance failure, because that's a big black cross next to your name and you're, shunned for eternity. So do you see changes to the framework to inculcate that? But how between the mission boards aligned to civil service reform, do you turn around this oil tanker of risk averse, nothing can be allowed to fail, so either money is just pumped into it to keep the myth going of a work in progress? How do you change that culture of incentivization and risk when society is moving away from entrepreneurial risk-taking? I mean, you're almost trying to push the civil service and the machine in a way which the tide is flowing against.
I don't know that society is moving away from entrepreneurial risk-taking. Society likes the fruits of entrepreneurial risk-taking. There are companies that we use every day, Airbnb, Spotify, WhatsApp, didn't exist 20 years ago. They were all built on the basis of entrepreneurial risk-taking, and they have changed the way that we think about travel. They've changed the way that we consume music. When I started consuming music, I went to the record store and I bought a vinyl album and it had 12 records on it.
Is this when we have to say you don't look old enough?
And I played those 12 records, and I've been through all the iterations of cassette tapes. I showed my daughter some cassette
marvellous
tapes.
things.
She couldn't believe them. We then went through the world of CDs. Now we're in the world of single songs and playlists, and it's entrepreneurial risk-taking that took us there, and I could say the same
No,
about travel.
I take that point, but those are usually very small, fleet of foot, experts focused in a particular area trying something different. Those are not the immediate words. I'm a huge fan of it, but those are not the immediate words which one would put your hand to when seeking to describe the organisation of the size, complexity and age, maturity, of the civil service and UK government.
Yeah, that's right, but what we're trying to do is say that when the world is changing so rapidly in the way that I've just talked about in terms of the consumption of music, in the private sphere, let's take some of the learning of that and apply that ingenuity and creativity and capacity to change to the public sphere too. It's not easy. It's not easy. I could give up. I could say,
don't do that.
It's not worth the effort. We'll just do everything the way we've always done it. And if you don't worry, you don't have to innovate, because if you never innovate, you've got no chance of failure. But I don't think that would be a very good
I agree.
way to run government.
I'm sure as a committee we will, as you would expect, monitor this and be interested to hear progress as the time goes by. I'm going to call Richard quickly. I'm then going to John Grady. I've got Michelle, Lauren, Richard, Marcus, Peter, anything on this section? No, fine.
Well, yeah,
in which case I shall put you, Peter, on the list. But let's turn to Richard quickly. Richard.
Thank you for everything so far. But taking it back to the very beginning, what excites you and therefore the country? What we should be excited about mission-led government as opposed to whatever led government we've had before?
No one's going to be excited by a label, but there's a serious point underneath this, which is, I believe, a loss of faith in the capacity of governments to deliver outcomes, because people have seen their tax burden rise, but there is a feeling that things don't work as well as they should. So waiting lists are longer, we don't build enough homes, and so on and so forth. So I prefer to think the label I care less about, but the outcome I do care about. And if we can get the system to really focus on the outcome and really drive for a better outcome in any of those fields that are in the plan for change that we published last week, then I think people will notice the outcome and will hopefully notice that these services that we're talking about are really trying to deliver for people. So I don't know whether you want to call that exciting. You could call it just, these services doing their job. But I think it's important. And I also believe the basics in politics and government are grossly underpriced. And people always want the new and the shiny and the exciting, but a health service that treats you in a decent time is a very good thing, and it shouldn't be underpriced or undervalued, and the same with the other public services that we're talking about.
Right, so in terms of the missions as well, it has to be cross-cutting, and we've talked about silos. So in terms of removing the silo aspect of a let's call it a project, what would success look like for you? So you could give us an example if you wish, but in terms of avoiding that silo handbrake.
Well, a lot of them do cut across departments. If you want children to have the best start in life, which is one of the things we talked about in the document, yes, that involves the Department for Education, but it also involves the Department for Health. It also involves making sure there are enough decent homes in the country for when people are growing up in a decent environment. It's more than one department, and that's true of most things here. So we're trying to encourage people to work together. I know this will sound a bit like a subjective point, but I think one of the fortunate things about the team of ministers that's come into government is that at cabinet level, certainly, it's pretty much the same team as was in the shadow cabinet. They've worked together for a few years. The team spirit is good. And so I think there are some good grounds for working together. But I am aware of the departmental DNA as well. It's a strong thing, and it's a strong pool. This is not easy, but it's important if we want to get the right outcomes.
Agreed. And I suppose the last one, probably more for Ms Little, is we've got mission champions in our party, and I know you've got mission champions at senior level. Is there a consideration to put mission champions at the very low level of teams, so you've got this sort of mass of DNA, as it were, coming from the other end?
It's a great question. I mean, every single department has sort of taken forward their responsibilities for missions in the way that's most appropriate. And I know there are departments who have created mission focuses at every single level. And obviously some departments are more involved and others less so directly. So yes, but I don't think it will be a consistent one-size-fits-all.
Thank you.
And in these mission boards and all this, who arbitrates? Who is the final? Is it? I appreciate where the Prime Minister sits in the pyramid, but in that perennial battle of delivery between the Cabinet Office and the Treasury.
Who are the? I didn't.
Who has the whip hand? Because you'll have you're on all the mission boards, policies evolve, cross departmental working, etc., and everything's going hunky dory, and then the happy faces of the Treasury come across it, frown, wrinkle their noses, raise their eyebrows, and go, "It's a lovely idea, but you have to wait for the spending review, or you have to wait for that, or we simply can't afford it, or we're not doing that, etc." Are you allowed to metaphorically shout at the Treasury? Not that one would shout at the Treasury, of course. But, you know.
The team spirit between us and the Treasury is very good. So there's been no need for any shouting.
And you've said that with a wonderfully wry smile, Chancellor, so thank you for that. Richard, had you finished?
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you. John Grady and Michelle. John.
Yeah, thank you. An interesting thing you've said there was you pointed to a need for a greater emphasis on users of services and also on not having a cookie cutter approach and the need for regional, in my case as an MP for Glasgow East, different approaches across our family of nations. I mean, something that's long vexed me, wondered whether homelessness policy people speak enough to homeless people, and drug user policies, which is a big issue in my seat, is developed in consultation with drug users. Might be a good place to start. Could you talk us through a bit how you're going about involving users and the people who need to benefit from these improvements?
I think it's a very good point, and there are well-documented examples, if you take homelessness, of people bouncing around between different services, probably in a cumulative way, not getting a good outcome for themselves and costing an awful lot of money. There was a famous article written many years ago called $1 Million Murray about homeless guy in Reno, Nevada, who was the example of this. And they worked out that for all the money being spent on Murray, they could have put him up in $1 million apartment rather than him bouncing around these services. So it's an international problem. And we have examples of people like $1 Million Murray here in the UK as well. So joining this up is really important. And that's what we're trying to do at a macro level through the mission work. But it's really important when you get to the service on the ground too.
I wonder, it might be a question for Kat as much as you. I wonder, Ms. Little, if you could give us some concrete examples of how you're going to go about that, or how the government go about that, where they see improvements could be made.
Well, every single part of Whitehall has really taken the challenge that the new government has brought to us, which is very, very clear. You need to consult, you need to engage end users, and we've got to diversify the way in which we develop policy. So we've done some of that in the past, so supporting families is a really good example of where there's been intensive user engagement. But when we look at some of the test and learn examples that the Chancellor spoke about, that is a good example where we're talking directly to end users in local places. So I won't go through all of the different locations that we're currently thinking about working with, but that team not only has people seconded from the front line in the team in the Cabinet Office, we are engaging with people directly on the front line.
Thanks.
Hi. The missions will require a localised approach if they're going to be successful, and for the government to be successful. So my first question is, how are devolved and local tiers of government and the private sector being incentivised to act in tandem with the government at the moment?
Really good question. So if you go through the different policy areas, some are reserved, some are devolved. If I take the example of energy, there are aspects of energy policy which are reserved, but there are also things like planning frameworks which are devolved in different parts of the country. The dialogue on this has been really good, actually, with between the UK government, Scottish government, Welsh government. Everybody knows there's a challenge for the country to move to clean power. Everybody wants to do it. I think it's been done in a really respectful way so far. On terms of the private sector, there is a lot of private sector investment in this field, and there's potentially more. When I went to Scotland in, I think it was October, for the first meeting of the Council of Nations and Regions, Scottish Power were announcing a doubling of their investment from 12 to 24 billion over the coming years. That wasn't money from the state, that's money from a private company going into clean energy. And the message from the industry to us is, if you can deal with the planning blockages and you can help us get connections to the grid, there will be more investment that wants to come in to the UK. So it isn't just a Department of Energy issue, it's an issue for all the different governing administrations throughout the UK and for the private sector too. And around the world, in this energy transition, most of the investment that's spent in different countries will come from the private sector. We believe in the state. This government does believe in the state having its front foot forward on this. That's why we established GB Energy, and we think there are certain technologies where some shared risk taking can help make a market and get things moving. We do believe in industrial policy. We don't believe that if you just leave everything to the market, it will work. But over the piece, even allowing for that quite, as I say, front-leaning posture, if you wish, most of the investment will come from the private sector.
I'm very conscious the Treasury Minister's on his feet and votes are expected shortly. I presume we would all like to pause and go to vote when the bell rings.
Yes, we're in favour of.
I'm perfectly relaxed about it, but you see, Pat, it's the enthusiasm of the young which is driving us to do these things.
Yeah.
So, let's just try and go through this. Michelle, had you finished on what you... Yes.
One more question.
Please.
Do you think this? So really thank you for the answer. This is slightly different but kind of on the same course. So across the country we have different elements of local government. We have mayors that are working really effectively. In Nottinghamshire, in some areas of Nottinghamshire we have 3 tiers of local government. In some areas of Nottinghamshire we have 2, for example. So again, it's going back to the effectiveness of being able to deliver those missions locally. In the past, under the previous Labour government, there was things like Pathfinder projects that Labour, that local authorities run out. So my question is, are the systems that are in place locally robust enough to deliver some of these things effectively? And could we run into a situation where there are some disparities between different parts of the country? So, for example, Greater Manchester has a mayor that seems to be going King of the North, etc., where some areas don't even have a mayor at the moment. So how do we tackle that in ensuring we achieve those missions across the country?
I'm not redesigning the whole of local government, but there is an English devolution white paper coming. There is an offer to parts of the country that don't have mayors to have them, but it's an offer. My own personal view is I think that elected mayors have been a successful project in the country. We started back when I was in government last time with the establishment of the London Mayor, the Greater London Mayor. You then referred to Manchester. I represent Wolverhampton in the West Midlands, where first under Andy Street and now Richard Parker, we've had 2 good people doing that. So I think it's personally a good model. Might not be for every part of the country, they might not want it, but I think these powerful voices have done well. So, I don't propose to redesign local government as part of this project, and the tapestry of the UK is varied, as you say. But I think when you think about these goals, most local authority leaders will want to do what they can to implement them in one way or another.
Well, I'd say as a former local government minister, the more unitaries and the more directly elected mayors we have, the better. Because it's much easier for Whitehall and Westminster to deal with, rather than this multi-layered mosaic that we have, as charming and delightful as it is. Peter, on the subject of charming and delightful.
I'm going to disagree on that point, Mr. Chair. On the matter of tests and learns, I've been reading your speech, very good speech while I've been in the room. Just returning to this point of tests and learns, I mean, I've often thought that local authorities are a very good example of this, with sort of 330 odd different models of trying to address the same problems across the country, and you can take what you want from the better of those and ignore the worse. But on the question of better or worse, the nature of a trial is that some things are going to get better and some things are going to get worse in places, and that raises the question of a postcode lottery with a lot of these. And my question really is, where does the democratic accountability lie? Because if a council messes up, you vote the council administration out, or you at least have that option where they've failed your community. When it comes down to parts of the civil service and arm's length bodies, and I speak from experience as a former local government leader, where they get things wrong, and sometimes incredibly wrong, your only option is trying to beg and beg and beg for months for a meeting with a minister for 15 minutes, where you've got a million different directions, being pulled in a million different directions. You know, my question with a lot of these is, if we're going to be experimenting on bits of the country, where do those residents within those bits of the country get a say in that? Well,
these test and learn projects should involve residents. That's never a perfect thing to do, but they should be doing that. As I said earlier, this is about better things for citizens, so why wouldn't we want to do that? At the more macro level, the truth is, in a democratic system like the one that we have, if a department messes up, it'll be the minister who's in front of this committee or whatever the relevant select committee is in the House of Commons set up, and they'll be answering for it, and that's in the nature of our system, and that's always been the case.
I mean, sorry, but I accept that with any uniform policy that is a reasonable expectation. But in the case of where you get a particular difference in one locality from another locality, that seems to be diminishing the concerns of those particular localities that are disproportionately more affected than the rest of the country.
I mean, look, there is variation around the country at the moment, and we live with it. Some places have better bus services than others, and that is it. I don't think I don't feel the need. This phrase about postcode lottery, it's always a tension, isn't it? That if you can get something in one part of the country and you can't get it in another, and in the nature of devolving power, you will get difference. There's not much point in devolving power if you still want everything to be absolutely uniform. So I think if we're going to be a country that believes in devolving power, then that's a consequence. I still go on TV sometimes. 20 odd years, 25 years after the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate have been established, and people say to me, don't you know that A happens in Scotland or doesn't happen in England or the other way around? What have you got to say about that? And so this was a great new discovery. And I say, well, actually, that is in the... I know this isn't the way you meant it, but it's in the nature of devolution. So if we devolve things, I think there's a... Is that our division, Bill?
I think that's a vote, yeah.
Maybe I better stop talking.
Well, we've got a minute. We've got 8 minutes to get down, haven't we? Or whatever it is. So we've got a few minutes.
We're all new.
Lauren, you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly, just on
give you a quick answer.
Yeah, on the outputs for the test and learn. Obviously, they're described as small projects at 6 to 12 months. I'm just wondering, are you envisaging them being sort of a quick win approach, or how deep are you expecting them to get into problems like temporary accommodation? Because obviously, if you look at that holistically, that can go right back to the problems of housing supply in the country.
Yes, it can, and they can't magic up more housing and properties. What I think they can do, forgive me, is look at how the available properties are used, look at how long families are staying there. Is there a quicker way to move them into permanent accommodation? Is there a better way to use data? Are they getting the right services when they're in there? You've often got vulnerable families living in accommodations you wouldn't want to live in for a long time. So I think there's a number of questions they can look at without getting a magic wand out and saying, right, we're going to produce X more houses in this area over the next 6 months. I mean, we do want to build more houses, but that's a longer term project. Mr. Chairman, I'm in your hands, but no, I think the mood of the meeting is they want to go and vote.
Let's suspend. I think, colleagues, there are at least 2 votes, I think, now. So we won't come backwards and forwards in between votes. I think we'll just might as well just stay down, do them both, and
okay,
Chancellor, are you happy to come back?
Yeah, that's fine.
let me just take you back, Miss Little, to a word that you used before we broke for the divisions, which, rather like the words PowerPoint, send a shiver down my spine and turn my whole being to lead. You used the word consultation. Once we've consulted on whatever it was. Whether one liked the changes to the MPPF, which the Chancellor brought forward shortly after the general election, it was refreshing in the directness and the speed with which those changes were introduced. No consultation, just a ministerial decision. Judge me by my actions. This is what I want to do. How concerned are you, Chancellor, that, and this I think might speak back to that risk aversion, slow everything down, that we consult to the death on everything, instead of ministers just saying, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're going to do it, this is how we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to evaluate the doing and the outcomes. Do you see changes in the approach to government itself being more prepared to be, for example, judicially reviewed in that balance between, let us consult about moving a semicolon from page 7 to page 8, which we were getting into the habit of?
It's a very broad question. Government wants to deliver, it wants to produce, it wants to focus on outcomes. Sometimes over big changes, you do have to consult on them. I think you mentioned the NPPF in your question. I think everybody acknowledges that it takes too long to get things built in the UK. And my colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister, was on the media on Sunday talking about this and her plans to break through some of that and to get things built more easily. She's determined to do that, and she's got the full support of everybody in the Cabinet for what she wants to do. So I can't give a blanket answer about consultation one way or the other, but people are impatient for delivery, and they're right to be.
Yes. So maybe a more flexible approach?
But sometimes you have to, by law and all of that, but we want to deliver, and time goes quickly.
Yes, thank you. Lauren, let's turn to you, please.
Yes. Just wanted to pick up on the reset of the EU-UK relationship. Obviously very aware that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has recently been to Europe to meet with EU finance ministers, which is fantastic. Just wondering if you can give us an update on progress or a timetable for the negotiations around that issue.
Okay. This is a big, important question. The really important thing that I want the committee to understand about the government's position is that there's a mood abroad that somehow we have to choose between a relationship with the United States and a positive relationship with the European Union or with Europe. We don't have to choose. This country should aim to have a good relationship with both. It's a really important point to make. Not everybody agrees with that. There are political voices out there who say you can't do that and you have to choose. We don't believe that. So it's just the first point to stress at the beginning. We're not going to rerun the Brexit debate. That debate has been had. The country's decided. The task of leadership that falls to us now is to make the best future we can, having made that decision. I believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really focused minds on some of the things that used to divide us. And when it comes to our fellow democracies across the Channel, we've got a great deal in common in terms of values. So within that position I said about not rerunning the Brexit debate and that, all that grand architecture, we want what the Chancellor referred to yesterday as a good, positive, adult relationship. There are certain specifics. We would like to see, for example, a veterinary agreement that would really ease the burden on our farming community, our food producers, and so on. Do we really think it's really important to have different standards on food between us and the European Union? Not sure that we really do. So there are specifics that we will pursue. I think the atmospherics start off in quite a good way, but these things are a discussion. There are interests. We won't do anything that we don't think is in the UK's national interest, but we think it's in the UK's national interest to have a good trading relationship with a group of countries which, taken together, remember, are still our biggest trading partner.
I completely agree. And are there any timetables for those individual negotiations, for instance, on the veterinary agreement?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's a standard review of the TCA timetable anyway, but I don't think you should expect this just to be around that. That may well just look at the technical operation of the agreement. I think there are other things we can
dear God.
Forgive me.
That was the shortest 20 minutes I've ever been promised. Should we just crack on?
You have to suspend.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's in your hands, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman, but I think if there's a division, maybe people might want to vote.
We are required.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have no discretion. We have no discretion, colleagues. I am required to suspend yet again whilst we go and vote on the criminal law. So let us go and vote on the criminal law.
Vote on the criminal
So
yes.
we're okay.
Just for today, not forever.
Chancellor, I know that I know time is pressing. We want to deal with two subjects, one incredibly briefly and then one in a little more detail. Just a very quick question, please, from me on behalf of the committee with regards to the Cabinet Manual. Eagerly expected and awaited at the Beano Annual of old. The previous government made a commitment to this committee that we would have sight of it before publication, we would have an opportunity to comment upon it. Does that still stand?
Are you telling me that the previous government made a promise to you and didn't keep it?
As a member,
shocked.
Well, that's because the Cabinet Manual wasn't published. So, so my question is, it's going to be published under your watch, Chancellor. So, do you stand by that commitment, or are you resigning from it?
Look, this document was written in 2011, I think, 2010, 2011. It's not been updated since. Is it the committee's view that the lack of the updating of the document has had a serious effect on the operation of government?
Well, we're not sure.
Seen it yet?
We haven't seen it yet.
I mean,
are you therefore proposing to do away with the Cabinet Manual?
No, but I'm saying it hasn't been updated for 13 years.
No, but
there's no doubt that the document's out of date. It still has us as members of the European Union, the committee may be aware, and various other things. So it'll need updated at some point. But I think you know the point I'm making. It's not happened for 13 years. We've been in office a few months.
Yeah, but I think the work, our understanding was that the work was in hand, that the election got in the way.
That's what they told you.
Have we been misled?
I don't know.
Miss Little?
Sorry, I don't know who told you what, but of course, you know, we have done some work on it, but when you have a new government, it's our job to revisit the content and to make sure that it's fit for purpose with ministers, and so we'll be doing that as is appropriate.
What I thought was going to be an easy question has now turned into the Schleswig-Holstein one. So can we just confirm that there is going to be a Cabinet Manual?
Well, there is a Cabinet Manual, but it's out of date.
Let's break this down into its composite parts. There is a Cabinet Manual which is out of date.
Yes.
Is it your intention to review, revise and reissue?
Yeah, look, it's hard to defend a document that's out of date, but the reason
I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking
the reason I'm answering in the way I am is this hasn't been updated for 13 years and counting. Now, I'm not sure to what extent the lack of the updating of the document has had a serious effect on the operations of government. That's open to debate. You could have a view, I could have a view. What we were determined to do when we came in was update the ministerial code.
Yes.
And we did that, and it's got some important changes in it, including the fulfilment of a manifesto commitment that we had to give the independent advisor the power to launch their own investigations. We also put the 7 principles of public life more at the heart of the document, and one or two other changes too. That ministerial code really, you know, was the priority for us in the first few months. It was recently reissued. I'm sure the Cabinet Manual will be updated at some point. I couldn't tell you exactly when.
So, I remain to be convinced whether that's a yes or a no answer. Maybe, I mean, if you've reached the conclusion that the Cabinet Manual has no role and little relevance, tell the committee, and you know.
I haven't reached that conclusion. What I'm saying is, we were focused on producing the updated ministerial code.
Yes.
And we did that and published that a few weeks ago.
Yes, but this is a question about the Cabinet Manual.
Yes.
So then my final question on this is, we will take as a given that it needs review and revision because it hasn't been done since 2011. That I take. We understand that will take a period of time. When it is, if it is to be done, and prior to its publication, is the commitment of the previous government still live to the predecessor committee that this committee would be shown it prior to its publication with the opportunity to comment upon under the Chatham House rule?
I mean, I haven't really got to that point yet. I'm not sure. Let me look at where we are when we get to updating it.
I mean, I think in the spirit of forging a positive relationship between the committee and the Cabinet Office, it would be a welcome thing to do. I have written to you on this not a very long time ago, so it's not a criticism that I haven't had a reply, but a detailed reply to that would be helpful. Let's turn in the time available now to intergovernmental relations. I turn to John, I think.
I think it might be my good friend Mr. Baker here.
It is indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm happy to ask a question, Chair, if that's helpful.
Whichever one of you, whilst I get rid of this.
Thank you, Chancellor. You talked earlier about the move for responsibility for intergovernment relations from the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities to the Cabinet Office. Now, the Cabinet Office website lists you as a Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, but it's not included in your official list of ministerial responsibilities published in November. So just for belt and braces, just to confirm that you are the lead Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, but also what you see as the responsibilities in that role that you will be taking forward.
I think the major responsibilities, there are always going to be different political parties around the table in different parts of the country. But it's really important that, accepting those political differences are there, that we have good working relationships. I think we've got off on quite a good footing. The Prime Minister went to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland within a couple of days of the election, really in the first weekend after the election. He deliberately chose to do that. There are a number of structures that have grown up over the years, many of them from individual agreements. For example, there are some structures that grew out of the Good Friday Agreement. There are others that did that. And the architecture for quite a lot of meetings is there. And we'll take the meetings seriously, but I think even more important than the meetings is that we try and have a good working relationship and the understanding that sometimes there will be political differences, and as I said in our discussion earlier, it's within the nature of devolution that there'll be different policies on some things in different parts of the country. But the Prime Minister took the view he wanted this function at the centre of government. I was very happy to do it. I think it's a serious responsibility and I certainly take it seriously.
And you mentioned the new structures which are in place, well, they're fairly new because a review took place in 2022 of the structures. In terms of your experience thus far, do you think those structures are the right ones, and are they effective in that helping achieve that reset of relations? You talked about a number of resets of relations, and certainly reset of relations with the devolved administrations. I know is something which you've talked about previously. So are those structures helping support that ambition?
Yes, the structures do help to support it. I think if you started from a completely blank sheet of paper, would you create all these different bodies? You might not, but they're there for a reason. And I think with most of them, if you took it away, then there would be objections to doing that because the agreement to have that body came out of something. So we're respectful of the historic reasons why it has built up in this way over the years. So I think the structures are important. They're the products of various agreements. And the informal, like any of these things, the bilateral meetings you have, the human contact you have, as well as the sort of formal round the table is important too. So we've had the Council of Nations and Regions, which have met a couple of months ago. We had the British-Irish Council, which met in Edinburgh on Friday. There was an inter-ministerial council that I chaired last week on, I think, the 3rd of December. We've had meetings with the mayors, I should say, on English devolution, the relationships between central government and the mayors are the responsibility of the Deputy Prime Minister. When we talk about intergovernmental relations, I'm talking about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So these structures are active and they're meeting.
And you think that these structures are meeting frequently enough? Is that about right at the moment?
Yeah, I don't think there's any lack of frequency of meetings. That's not the concern. The important thing is you have a good substantial discussion when you do it. For example, the Council of Nations and Regions that met, we focused quite a lot on energy and inward investment, and that was a good discussion. We've also had informal work as well. I mean, if I could give the committee an example, this wasn't part of the formal structures, but during the summer when there was some concern about the Mpox outbreak in various African countries, the government did what you would expect, was just to do some preparatory work. What if we got cases in the UK? Since then, we've had a few cases in the UK. And we had 2 or 3 calls involving health ministers from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, health secretary here, which I chaired, just to make sure we had an adequate vaccine supply, to make sure that the different health services in different parts of the country were talking to one another. How could we know, for example, if there was going to be a first British case, where in the UK it would be? That wasn't part of the formal structures, but it seemed to us to be good practice to work like that. And I think if you've got that spirit, you can take that into other areas too.
Absolutely, Chancellor, but there will be issues where there is dispute, I'm sure, and there is disagreement. And it struck me as surprising that given over the last Parliament, certainly with the Scottish Government, there were significant disagreements over the interpretation of the Equality Act, which ended up in the Supreme Court. There was great disagreement over the implementation of a deposit return scheme, which never actually happened in Scotland. But these are very, very high-profile disputes, and at no stage was the actual dispute resolution process used, which had been created in 2022 as part of the review. Do you think that the government would use those structures and the dispute resolution process to address with issues like that?
Well, they could. There's more than one mechanism for resolving disagreements. I mean, there is this structure of common frameworks where disagreements are supposed to be thrashed out. That's particularly to do with issues of trade and regulation and so on. There's the Internal Market Act, which is on the statute book too. And then there's, in one or two cases, we've had the courts, in the case that you mentioned. So there's more than one way of, if there's a disagreement of it playing out. Dispute resolution is one. I start from the spirit of trying to have as good a working relationship as I can, while understanding that sometimes devolution means a devolved body will go a different way. And I'm also realistic enough to know that when it comes to election time, sometimes we're dealing with people who are political opponents.
Finally, Chair,
yes,
do you think that the current system for intergovernmental relations has sufficient transparency to allow the committees of Parliament to scrutinise its discussions and decisions? And would you commit to sharing agendas ahead of meetings with this committee and accounts of what was discussed so that we can inform our deliberations and scrutiny of the intergovernmental relations and structures as well?
There's nothing secret about the structures.
I mean, in terms of what the meetings and what's being discussed and what the programme of deliberation is.
There's usually a communique about what was discussed. For example, at the British-Irish Council on Friday, there was a communique released afterwards. As in the nature of these things, it probably doesn't tell you everything that's said, but you probably don't want to know that anyway. So I don't see any secrets about it.
You see the communicators as providing enough information for committees to allow us to scrutinise the operation of the structures?
They'll tell you what was discussed. We also had a press conference which may or may not be related to the subject of the meeting, but that's up to the press.
I think the way of dealing with these things are rather different when we're dealing with the Republic than when we're dealing within the four nations of the UK.
Well, yes, of course, the Republic of Ireland is not on all the structures.
I don't think we have a communique when you sit down with Hollywood, do they?
Well, I don't know if we issued to be honest, I'd have to check whether we issued a formal communique after the Council of Nations and Regions, but I think the agenda was public. We talked about it. I don't think there was any secret about it.
There's a willingness there, anyway, to engage and to
yes,
ensure we have
very
the
much so.
information. Thank you, Chancellor.
John Grady.
Yeah, just...
And I'm conscious of time, so John, Luke, and then Lauren wants a very quick question out with this. But
well,
so
3 questions then.
Short questions and short answers.
Yes, on the reset of relations with Scotland, and Sir Keir was in Scotland on the Sunday afternoon, having been elected as Prime Minister, effectively, on the Friday morning. We've heard a lot in the past, over the last few years, about things that Westminster's stopping Scotland doing, but of course what the Scottish Government does can have a material impact on our shared goals, for instance in energy policy. If there's a really sclerotic planning process in Scotland, that will hold back building offshore wind farms that reduce the cost of energy for consumers across our family of nations. So how effectively on a ground level is the reset operating to enable the UK government to share its concerns with the Scottish government when there are things when we need to work together productively?
I think the speed of planning is probably a common challenge in all parts of the UK to get these things built quicker. The challenge of the grid is also a common challenge, getting them connected. People in the industry will say, I can build a wind farm in whatever, 18 months, but then getting the connection to the grid might take me a lot longer. So these are common challenges. I think I mentioned in some of the earlier questions on energy, I think the cooperation has been quite good. And we do respect that while aspects of energy policy are reserved, something like planning is devolved. I think the joint working on that has been quite good so far.
And then on to the Council for Nations and Regions. How will that interact with the existing structures?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. So you can have some subject-specific meetings underneath it. So, for example, I chaired the Interministerial Council last week. That doesn't involve the First Ministers, apart from in the Northern Irish case, where the First Minister and Deputy First Minister operate in a very sort of joint team-like manner. It's with Deputy First Ministers, and that might discuss something more specific. So we had a good discussion last week about resilience, which is a common challenge across all parts of the UK. So it fits, it works. As I say, if you were starting from a blank sheet of paper, you might not have decided all these things, but I'm respectful of them because they're the product of agreements. And if you've got structures, for example, that arose out of the Good Friday Agreement, I'm going to keep them there and respect them and work with them.
The final question from me, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, is you've expressed some enthusiasm for devolution within England to metro mayors and the like, and there's a real concern in Glasgow about the state of Glasgow and whether it's got enough support from central government and whether things are over-centralised in Scotland. In your experience, would metro mayors for cities like Aberdeen and Glasgow be a good idea?
Well, it's for people in Scotland to decide, but I think they are a good idea. And I think it would be quite an exciting debate because these are great cities with great character. I'm very fond of them. I grew up in Glasgow, wonderful place. I love Glasgow. It would be not for me to decide, but I think it's been a successful model where it's been tried, and it can give a city a really good, strong voice. So that's a debate for people in Scotland to have. I now don't live there, so I don't have a direct say in it. It's up to them, but I think it could be good.
Okay. Luke.
So you talk about if you were drawing these structures and powers up from scratch, you wouldn't draw them as they are today. But do you have a plan for what devolution looks like as the end game? If you were moving deals and structures towards an ideal and a better state, do you know what that looks like? What is the end game?
I don't have a plan to change devolved powers. When I was saying that, I was mentioning that there's quite a lot of structures for us to meet. But on devolved powers and so on, look, we have by design, a very powerful Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, and rightly so. Way back in the day, we talked about my longevity. I was involved in the creation of that policy a long time ago when I was a bit younger and had a full head of hair. But that's a long time ago. And the powers have developed to some extent since then. It's also true of Wales. I'm very optimistic and hopeful about the Northern Ireland Executive being back up and running. And I think Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly are doing a great job together. There's a lot of hope for Northern Ireland with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in place, and I've really enjoyed working with them in the few months that I've been doing this. The London Mayor, I think, has been a really good model. We talked about city mayors a minute ago. I think it's also true in Manchester and other places. So, I'm an enthusiast for it. I don't have a grand design to change powers. I think this has become part of the British architecture now, part of the British Constitution, part of the British political system. And it's my job now, fast and forward to today, to work with certain parts of that to make sure we've got a good working relationship, and that's what I want to do.
Okay, thank you. Final question, very brief one from Lauren, and then...
Back in July, you discussed having a review of the UK National Resilience Strategy, and obviously very conscious with the geopolitics situation at the moment. The threat of a major cyber attack would obviously have a devastating effect potentially on Whitehall. Just wondering what you can tell us about the progress of that review and including its publication date.
It's a really good question.
All of our questions are really good, Chancellor. We are a really good committee.
Of course, a very good committee. On cyber specifically, I made a speech to a NATO conference that took place in London a few weeks ago. The threat of this is very real, involving both state and non-state actors. I was talking probably more that day about state actors, and the security services are very aware of this and doing everything they can to protect us, and I'm really grateful to them for the work that they do. But in terms of defence, if you like, this is an aspect of defence that is so important now. We used to just think about it in terms of military hardware. Military hardware is still important, but cyber defences are too. On resilience more broadly and timetable, when I made the statement in the House in July, it was in response to Module 1 of the COVID inquiries report, where we said we'd carry out a review of resilience. We are under an obligation to respond to Module 1 of that report by the middle of January next month, and I intend to meet that deadline.
Just one quick follow-up, if I may, Chair. Just around particularly the cyber risk, just interested, my background is in insurance regulations. I'm obviously aware there's a great deal of expertise in that particular industry. Who are the stakeholders that you are engaging with specifically around the cyber risk aspects of that review and that strategy?
We do a lot. We talk to local resilience forums. We talk to industry. We have what we call critical national infrastructure, which are obvious things, the power system, the utilities, the major financial institutions and so on. So we have a lot of stakeholders in this. We also have the National Cyber Security Centre, which is a public-facing part of this, which is there to work with institutions to help them increase the strength of their cyber defences. So that's a public resource that can be used, and I would encourage people in business and academia, cultural organisations. We saw what happened with the British Library and how damaging a cyber attack can be. Use the National Cyber Security Centre to do what we can. This is not foolproof. It is a constant effort, and there are people probing. There's ransomware. It has got to be part of our defence and resilience as a country.
Thank you.
Chancellor. Permanent Secretary, thank you both very much indeed. I'm told it's not too early in the month to say every good wish for a very happy Christmas and prosperous New Year. You'll obviously be writing the Cabinet Manual, Chancellor, over the Christmas turkey. I wish you well with that. I thank colleagues for taking part. Thank you for your time. Order